Good morning. Thanks for joining us at a news conference this morning to mark the completion of the spring sitting of the second session of Alberta's 30th legislature. I'm here with Government House Leader Jason Nixon to summarize all the important bills that were passed to help Alberta cope with COVID, to help save lives and livelihoods, and to help to keep more of our government's commitments to Albertans. Jason and I just wrapped up the second straight all-night sitting here in the legislature a couple of hours ago, and right in front of me here are the 34 bills that were passed by this legislature this spring, the most productive legislature in Canada by a country mile, getting the work done for Albertans. I want to congratulate and thank all MLAs for a job well done under very difficult circumstances. The arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic in Alberta in March was an unprecedented event in the lives of Albertans. It launched the worst public health crisis since the Spanish flu a century ago, and it was accompanied by the worst global economic downturn since the Great Depression, made even worse, of course, by the lowest oil prices in history in recent weeks and months. Almost every other provincial and territorial legislature in Canada shut down daily sittings back in March. The National Parliament in Ottawa suspended sittings for 5 weeks starting March 13th, and then in May, they voted to end sitting until this September. But here in Alberta, we decided to do the people's business. My view was that we should show up to do our work safely, just like everyone else who possibly could. And we have done that. We have worked hard for Albertans. In fact, we just, as I mentioned, finished our second consecutive all-night sitting, and I think I've had 3 hours of sleep since Monday morning, if I'm not losing count here. In total, the Alberta legislature sat 52 days this year, far more than any other legislature in Canada, including the federal parliament. In fact, nearly twice as many days as the average amongst legislatures from coast to coast. We passed these 34 bills into law, including numerous bills enabling government actions needed to help protect the lives and livelihoods of Albertans. This is also twice the average number of bills passed by legislatures across Canada this spring. Now, I know the public sees only a small part of the work that goes on into the legislative process, mostly through some media coverage of debates and votes, but beneath and behind all of that lies a huge amount of work by ministers, their staff, dedicated public servants, House committees that review and amend legislation, the public stakeholders who provide important input, and the researchers, writers, and lawyers who actually craft these bills. I want to thank everyone who worked so hard, including many evenings and weekends during the daunting circumstances of the pandemic, to prepare these 34 bills and to carry them into the laws of Alberta. Let me recognize their efforts, including on several bills that provided emergency relief and support for Albertans, with a brief summary of each of these bills. Bill 1 was the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act, which strengthens the rule of law against those who seek to harm our economy and kill jobs by obstructing, damaging, or interfering with the construction or operations of essential infrastructure. We also passed a government motion on the same issue to say that people have a lawful right to protest, of course, but people cannot legally trespass on and impair critical public infrastructure like railways and highways. Bill 2, the Gaming, Liquor and Cannabis Amendment Act, part of our ongoing effort to end the war on fun, got rid of some antiquated red tape and regulation, including by giving municipalities more flexibility to let their residents consume alcohol responsibly in local parks. And let me just say, a lot of these bills were introduced before COVID, so if they don't seem like they make sense in the current context, it's work that we began before the pandemic started. Bill 3, the Mobile Home Sites Tendencies Amendment Act, gives mobile home renters and landlords the same access to the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service as other renters and landlords, so they don't have to resort to the courts to defend themselves. And let me just pause to thank Service Alberta Minister Nate Glubish and his officials for having seen that problem, which has existed for a very long time, and having resolved it. I also want to thank former NDP MLA Robin Luff, who left the NDP caucus because of that government's refusal to act to protect mobile home renters and owners. Bill 4, the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Act, the Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act, acts on a recommendation of the McKinnon panel by committing the government to table a budget in February each year, which will improve fiscal planning for all organizations affected by the province's budget. Bill 5, the Fiscal Measures and Taxation Act, achieves efficiencies by ending a number of dedicated funds and tax credits which had outlived their useful purpose. It also introduced the Alberta Child and Family Benefit to support Alberta families most in need, and it established new long-term funding arrangements for local governments. Bill 6, the Appropriation Act of 2020, provided authority for $56 billion in government spending this year, so critical to help us. We passed that right in the first days of the pandemic really hitting us here in Alberta, and that gave us the spending authority to surge $500 million additional dollars into healthcare and $15 billion overall in fiscal action to protect people during the pandemic. While Bill 7, the Responsible Energy Development Act, streamlined and brought consistency to the regulatory process for new oil and gas projects, fixing a broken system under Alberta's regulatory timeframes that had become uncompetitive with other energy-producing places around the world. Bill 7, the Responsible Energy Development Amendment Act, builds on our commitment to review the Alberta Energy Regulator and restore Alberta's reputation with investors as a leader in predictable and efficient regulation, ensuring projects get reviewed in a timely manner, another commitment made to Albertans in the last election. Bill 8, the Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act, protects vulnerable Albertans at risk of being trafficked, and it strengthens survivors' ability to escape physically, emotionally, and financially damaging abuse. It's a key part of our comprehensive action plan to fight the modern slavery that is known as human trafficking. Bill 9 is the Emergency Management Amendment Act, and it responded to the COVID-19 pandemic by enabling local and provincial states of emergencies to exist at the same time for the first time in Alberta law, thus giving local governments the authority and the autonomy to manage emergency measures in ways that respond most effectively to their local circumstances and needs, because we realized that in a big, diverse province like Alberta, a one-size-fits-all approach isn't always the best approach. Bill 10, the Public Health Emergency Powers Amendment Act, was also a response to the COVID crisis, giving law enforcement agencies more capacity to enforce public health orders designed to contain the spread of the virus. Bill 11, the Tendencies, Statutes, Emergency Provision Amendment Act, provided new protections for renters at risk of eviction after losing their jobs and incomes because of the pandemic. And I was meeting with Service Alberta Minister Glubish yesterday, and I'm very pleased to see that the very positive effect that's had in encouraging tenants and landlords to work out solutions to avoid evictions during this critical period. Bill 12 is the Liabilities Management Statutes Amendment Act, which enables the Orphan Well Association, the OWA, to better manage and accelerate the cleanup of oil field sites, which don't have a responsible owner. Combined with our billion-dollar site rehabilitation partnership with Ottawa and our earlier $100 million loan to the Orphan Well Association, we're now we're now creating thousands of jobs, good oil field service jobs, while undertaking the biggest oil patch cleanup effort in Alberta history, addressing a long-standing environmental liability. Bill 13, the Emergency Management Amendment Act, refined the authority granted to local governments to manage emergency public health measures during the pandemic that I mentioned just a bit earlier. Bill 14, the Utility Payment Deferral Program Act, provided Albertans, including business owners, who lost work and revenue due to COVID, with a 90-day deferral period on paying their utility bills. I think that's been a big help, practical help to Albertans and to job creators. Bill 15, the Choice in Education Act, this is again one that was introduced before the pandemic and was a key election platform commitment. It expanded one of the greatest strengths of Alberta's education system, and that is the range of options, the diversity of choices, the pluralism that is available for parents and students to choose the schooling that works best for them. from public schools and Catholic schools to charters and independents and homeschooling, which of course more Albertans now have experience with. And I want to thank Minister LaGrange for her great work on that. It also, by the way, enshrines into Alberta law, for the first time ever, an important provision of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, recognizing that parents have a prior right to choose what kind of education is best for their kids. Bill 16 is the Victims of Crime Strengthening Public Safety Amendment Act, which preserves support for victims of crime while expanding the capacity of Alberta's legal system to deter crime and prevent others from being victimized. And just a comment to say thank you and congratulations to Minister of Justice and Solicitor General Doug Schweitzer, who introduced several bills this session and has many more to come in the fall session ahead. Bill 17, the Mental Health Amendment Act, responds to a 2019 court ruling by strengthening legal rights protections for the mentally ill, by reducing red tape in the mental health system, and by improving access to care while reforming Alberta's mental health review panels. Bill, and by the way, that was in part a response to court decisions. It was a very time-sensitive manner, and I want to thank the official opposition for their cooperation in its expeditious passage. Bill 18 is the Corrections Alberta Parole Board Amendment Act and is part of our quest for a fair deal and for more autonomy for Alberta within the Canadian Federation. It creates an Alberta Parole Board to provide a fairer, faster, and more responsive justice system, and to shut the revolving door that allows repeat offenders to target Albertans, especially in rural areas. Bill 19, the Tobacco and Smoking Reduction Amendment Act, was the product of a province-wide review led by MLA Jeremy Nixon and a consultation with thousands of Albertans that led to a new law reducing the health harms associated with smoking and secondhand smoke and addressing the rise in youth vaping. I know that that bill has been criticized by some for some claim it doesn't go far enough, but I would remind people that Alberta was the only province in Canada without legislation governing vaping, including under the previous government. This is important, and we think a very balanced approach, an important step forward. Bill 20 is the Real Estate Amendment Act, which fixes a dysfunctional regulatory agency in the past by restructuring and refocusing the Real Estate Council of Alberta on its core mission, licensing and regulating the province's real estate sector, and we've had rave reviews for that from the hard-working women and men in our realty sector. And I want to again thank Minister Glubish for having taken that initiative. Bill 21, the Provincial Administrative Penalties Act, changes how Alberta penalizes impaired drivers and handles traffic ticket disputes by shifting cases out of the courts to free up judicial and police resources so they can focus on other serious offenses. And that is it's a measure, it's an approach that is now exists in British Columbia and Manitoba for quite some time. It has reduced the number of impaired driving offenses and accidents and fatalities in those provinces. It has been endorsed by Mothers Against Drunk Driving and law enforcement officials, and it will also critically help to clear up the large backlog in the provincial court, which is one of the reasons for the revolving door for those charged with property crimes that have really victimized so many rural Albertans. So we hit multiple birds, I should say, with that one stone. Thanks again to the Department of Justice for their important work and to the NDP opposition for, I think, their thoughtful consideration of that bill and cooperation on its adoption. Bill 22 is a personal favorite of mine. It's the Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act. It's our third Red Tape Reduction Act, and it reduces and speeds up the regulatory process across government, including for new oil sands projects, to encourage investment and to increase Alberta's competitiveness, helping our economy recover from the pandemic and recession in the long term. Bill 23 is the Commercial Tendencies Protection Act, and it fills gaps in Ottawa's emergency commercial rent assistance program by protecting commercial tenants who are experiencing COVID-related financial challenges from rent hikes, from late payment penalties, and from evictions. I'm getting close to the end here, only 10 more to go. This is how busy we've been. Bill 24, the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Statutes Amendment Act, that's a mouthful, provides flexibility to leave some ministerial orders to protect the health of Albertans in place after the provincial state of public health emergency was lifted in mid-June. And I'll just pause to say that we felt it was no longer necessary, we didn't need all of the extraordinary powers in the Public Health Act once we had gone past the peak of infections and hospitalizations in Alberta earlier this spring, but there were some I'll say discrete or limited powers that we may need for some time to come. For example, the ability to survey international arrivals at airports to make sure that they don't have a high temperature, that they don't have COVID symptoms, and that they do have a plan to comply with the 14-day quarantine requirements. So limited application of some of those powers for the future to help keep the province safe. Bill 25 is the Protecting Alberta Industry from Theft Act, which responds to rising property crimes, especially in rural Alberta, by cracking down on criminals when they try to sell stolen metal for scrap. And that's an important, I should say, arrow in our quiver of combating the rural crime wave of the past few years. Bill 26, the Constitutional Referendum Amendment Act, sets out the rules governing province-wide votes on all kinds of important issues, including those related to Alberta's constitutional fight for fairness, such as the grossly unfair current equalization formula. So that's the legislation that will empower the government to consult Albertans broadly. Very important democratic reform. Bill 27 is companion legislation in a way. It's the Alberta Senate Election Amendment Act, and it's another element of our fight for a fair deal, updating the rules for our next Senate election to choose the representatives of Alberta in the upper chamber in Ottawa, rather than accepting unelected appointees of the Prime Minister. And this was another commitment that we made to Albertans in the last election. That Senate election will occur concurrent with the next municipal elections in October of 2021. Bill 28 is the Vital Statistics Protecting Albertans from Convicted Sex Offenders Amendment Act, and it prevents rapists, pedophiles, and other convicted sex criminals from changing their names to escape their pasts and potentially to victimize more innocent people. And again, a credit to Minister Glubish for having taken that initiative. Alberta is now the second province in Canada after Saskatchewan to have done so, and I will be pressing, as I already have begun to do so, pressing all of the premiers to have all provinces and territories do the same thing so that that convicted sex offenders can't move from one province to another just to change their name and hide their identity from potential victims. I want to thank as well the NDP opposition here for their cooperation on that important bill. Bill 29 is the Local Authorities Election Amendment Act, and it modernizes the rules governing municipal elections, including by changing campaign finance regulations, to strengthen local democracy by leveling the playing field between incumbents and newcomers. Bill 30 is the Health Statutes Amendment Act and keeps a platform promise to cut surgical wait times by improving publicly funded access, I repeat, publicly funded, publicly insured access to charter surgical facilities, and by making it easier for physicians to opt into alternative forms of compensation, like the medical home model that has operated successfully in Alberta for some time and was also a platform commitment. That bill was just passed a couple of hours ago after the all-night sitting, and I want to congratulate Minister Shandro and his team for their hard work on that. The bill also adds more public members to review and oversight bodies and ensures that 14-day quarantine periods for international travelers during the COVID crisis. Bill 31 is the Environmental Protection Statutes Amendment Act, and it provides clarity and consistency for job creators in the sand and gravel industry while still maintaining stringent environmental protection regulations. If you want to learn more about that, I just posted on Facebook a couple of days ago a video with MLA Shane Getson from Laxton and Parkland, who helped to bring this issue to our attention. I really want to thank our Minister of Environment and Parks, Jason Nixon, for having responded to a very problematic court ruling, which could have effectively virtually shut down the Alberta sand and gravel industry, which in turn would have been a devastating blow to the entire construction industry. It could have risked thousands and thousands of jobs, but within, I think, 3 weeks of that decision from the Alberta Court of Appeals, we drafted and introduced this legislation. Again, I want to thank the opposition for their cooperation on a bill which I believe is going to help to save thousands of jobs. You probably didn't read about this in the media because it's good news that we got this done quickly and cooperatively. Bill 32 is the Restoring Balance in Alberta's Workplaces Act, which helps our economic recovery by providing employees and employers with clearer and more transparent rules promoting fairness and productivity. It also increases openness, transparency, and democracy within unions by giving rank-and-file union members access to information about how their union dues are spent, and by giving them the right to opt into spending on political causes that they don't agree with. Another platform commitment made and kept, very important, and we just passed that again this morning after an all-night session. Every element of that bill is something that we ran on in last year's election and is both important in terms of economic growth, but also democratizing the workplace for union members. Bill 33, the Alberta Investment Attraction Act, also supports Alberta's economic recovery plan by enabling the creation of an arm's-length corporation to attract job-creating private sector investment and to promote Alberta as a prime investment location for businesses from all across Canada and around the world. I want to thank Minister Tanya Furr and her team for their important work on that. And by the way, several other provinces have dedicated investment promotion agencies. I think Quebec has 600 people that works in theirs. We have the best offering, the best policies by far in Canada, and I would argue perhaps the very best in North America to attract new business investment. We just need to tell our story much more assertively, and that's what the Invest Alberta agency will do. Finally, thank you for your patience. Finally, Bill 34, which is the exciting Miscellaneous Statutes Amendment Act, makes a number of minor but necessary housekeeping amendments to several existing pieces of legislation. It's a standard piece of legislation in every session. So, let me catch my breath. This is a bold, ambitious list of legislative achievements for any government at any time. And I am proud to lead a government that accomplished so much of this during a particularly tough time in Alberta's history. One way or another, all of these bills derive from the record mandate that we received from Alberta voters in last year's election to get Alberta back to work, to stand up for Alberta, and to make life better for Albertans. They also respond to the tough hand that Alberta's been dealt this year, just as we were starting to recover from 5 years of economic stagnation. The pandemic-related legislation has helped our province get on top of the virus early and contain its spread, while impacting less of our economy and our lives than all of the other provinces in Canada and many parts of the world. Also enabling us to start reopening sooner than most jurisdictions across Canada and North America. And the recovery-focused legislation lays the foundation for a rapid and robust return to private sector-led growth, investment, and job creation. One of the big advantages of our relatively successful management of the pandemic in Alberta, thanks to Albertans' personal responsibility, and our openness our open for business message and policies, has been the NHL's decision to make Edmonton a hub city for the Stanley Cup playoffs. And I understand that the Oilers, I was in the legislature last night, but I think they won the exhibition match against the Flames. So congratulations, Oilers. The decision to come here was a gutsy call by the league and the players, but Alberta and Edmonton have a long history of producing champions. So it was the right call to decide this year's Stanley Cup champion here. We've got some work to do to flatten the COVID curve again in parts of Alberta, as Dr. Hinshaw has underscored. But we did it before, and I'm confident we'll do it again. And when we get through it, we will still have a deep fiscal and economic hole to dig ourselves out of. But we've got everything that we need. We have the people, the resources, and the indomitable Alberta spirit to get it done. That kind of resilience, that kind of culture of personal and civic responsibility, that irrepressible optimism and culture of enterprise is who we are. In some other parts of the world, the health and economic stresses caused by COVID seem to have fractured social unity. But in Alberta, the shared love for the beautiful place where we live, the pride that we have in what our ancestors built here, and the dreams we have for the boundless potential of our people and our resources remain as durable and as unifying as ever. We are truly blessed to live in such a place at any time, but especially in such a time of global turmoil as this. Thank you again to all of the MLAs. Thank you to the opposition party for cooperating. There have been a lot of fairly strongly felt disagreements, as you would expect in a vibrant democracy, but fundamentally I want to commend the opposition for having agreed to sit within COVID health rules over the past 3 months. And I especially want to thank our very dedicated public servants for their remarkable work over the past 5 months, helping us to get through the crisis and also achieve this record legislative outcome. And with that, I will invite the Government House Leader, Jason Nixon, to offer a few words.
Well, thank you, Premier, and good morning, everybody. Since I began the sitting by quoting Randy Bachman and saying that you ain't seen nothing yet, I think watching the Premier go through our legislative session which proves that we were correct about that, but I feel I should continue that tradition by quoting an artist that is near and dear to my own heart today, and that's country legend George Jones. In his 1998 hit, I'm a Survivor, which seems fit to describe the Alberta of today, Jones says, "As long as I'm breathing, you ain't heard the last of me yet." Well, as you heard from Premier Kenney, Alberta's bruised following the almost inconceivable events that have transpired in 2020. But Albertans are far from licked. As we all know, Albertans are made of sterner stuff than most folks. That said, the past few months and frankly the past few years have been rough. But as we said from the beginning, we will do everything to fight for Alberta. Premier Kenney has already outlined the many legislative accomplishments we've achieved since MLAs were first called back to the chamber in February. So I won't rehash that, but I do want to speak a bit to the human element. That is the fact that so many of my colleagues, as well as members of the official opposition, have been working feverishly in and out of the chamber to protect Albertans and set the stage for a successful relaunch that will create brighter days for Alberta. Our caucus, our officials, and legislative assembly officers have worked under tremendous pressure, drafting, reviewing, and ultimately passing legislation to make life better for Albertans at an incredible pace. We've responded in real time to a totally unprecedented pandemic and economic situation. And we've come out on the other side, more determined than ever to prove to Albertans that, to quote a line from Premier Kenney often used on the campaign trail, help is on the way and hope is on the horizon. In that vein, I would like to speak to a couple pieces of legislation and motions presented to the chamber that were near and dear to my heart. First is a piece of environment and parks legislation we affectionately referred to in my department as Inter-Sandman in our office. This was a Bill 31, which the Premier has referenced, which makes important changes to clarify the definition of certain minerals under the Environment and Protection Enhancement Act. This bill will save thousands of jobs in Alberta, and the speed which it was brought through the legislature is pretty impressive. It took a mere 10 weeks to get off the ground, through the legislature, passed, and received royal assent, which is basically a blink of an eye in government terms. The bill is a prime example of our commitment, Alberta's government's commitment, to do whatever it takes to stand up for Alberta's jobs. This is what it means when we say our government is laser focused on creating the freest and fastest moving economy in North America and protecting and creating jobs. That task has taken on a new urgency in light of COVID-19 and the global commodity slump and recent oil price wars. And I want my constituents, and indeed Albertans, to know that we see you struggling. We know that this is a tough time for our province, and Alberta's government has your back. Since we took office, we have committed to standing up for Albertans. These include vulnerable Albertans, which is why I'm so proud of my colleagues for passing Bills 8 and 28, the Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act, and the Vital Statistics Amendment Act, respectively. The former, as Premier Kenney mentioned, is meant to protect Albertans at risk of being trafficked and strengthen survivors' ability to escape physical, emotional, and financial abuse. The latter prevents convicted sex offenders from changing their names, making it more difficult to reoffend. These bills are important to me personally because of my past professional working life with survivors of these horrendous acts. There are unfortunately realities in our province and our country, and I can't express how proud I am to be part of a government that gives a voice to folks who may not ordinarily have one. Protecting survivors of human trafficking was a platform commitment. Ensuring convicted sex offenders can't change their information makes good sense. These are both examples of how we are able to balance responding in real time to a global pandemic while still fulfilling our urgent mandate and common sense items to protect Albertans and move Alberta forward. We also pledged to stand up for law-abiding gun owners against the federal government's gun grab. We did that through Government Motion 20, which highlights the needs for the federal government to refocus on the actual source of many illegal firearms. Motion 20 also sets the stage for the appointment of a chief firearms officer in Alberta. Now, I know we're all anxious to get out and enjoy the sunshine. I've been in the legislature with the Premier for about 48 hours off and on, and by the looks of what I can see out the window for the first time, it looks like it's getting pretty nice out there. So I will finish by extending my sincere thanks to my fellow caucus members, to the Premier for giving me the opportunity to be the government House Leader in the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. We've done an incredible work, both inside and outside the chamber, to promote and orchestrate a healthy relaunch, to protect the health and safety of Albertans during a tremendously stressful few months, as well as to stand up for folks who are our real boss, the great people of Alberta. And with that, the Premier and I would be happy to take some questions.
Okay, we'll begin the Q&A. Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
First is James Keller with the Globe and Mail. Go ahead, James.
Hi there. A question for the Premier. We now have a CEO of the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, Alicia Dubois from CIBC. How quickly do you expect the corporation to get this support out the door? And has the government identified any priority projects other than Trans Mountain, for which we've already seen an announcement earlier this month?
Thank you. Just 1 second. Need to do a little COVID sanitation here. Minister Nixon and I are not, as you can see, the same height. All right. So yes, we're very excited that we've attracted such a highly qualified individual who happens to be of an Indigenous background to lead that important initiative, the Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. The board is now fully functioning, and I understand they've already made decisions on at least one project to support, and an announcement will be made on that next week. It is involving a very exciting power project. That's all I'll say at this point, but it involves the financial participation in that project of several Alberta First Nations. I think it's going to be a great first project. I understand that the IOC has received at least a couple of dozen credible proposals, and if anything, I see the billion-dollar fund being potentially oversubscribed. The board is obviously taking its time carefully to review each proposal to ensure due diligence. We were clear from the beginning that the IOC had to make decisions based on criteria that are of commercial viability. This is not a check writing operation. This is about supporting commercially viable projects that involve Aboriginal co-ownership or financial participation. And as I say, the first project will be announced in a few days.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Amanda Stevenson with the Calgary Herald. Go ahead, Amanda.
Hi, Mr. Premier. You mentioned the Commercial Tendencies Protection Act. I wanted to ask you about the Federal Commercial Rent Assistance Program, which is expiring right away here. I understand there are a lot of Alberta small businesses that are still struggling with this issue, and I'm wondering if there's anything your government is planning to do to assist commercial tenants on rent relief specifically, or whether you'll be calling on the federal government to do more or extend or improve that program.
Yeah, so we are concerned that it remains a crisis for small and medium-sized businesses, and many of them are obviously, their future is in grave risk if they can't get reasonable terms around their commercial leases with landlords. I do believe that the package we introduced with the federal government earlier in the spring was very helpful, and I also will reiterate that landlords, it is clearly in their financial interest to be patient with tenants during this time, because if they evict people, there are very few folks lining up to take that empty space. So we would once again implore landlords to do the rational thing and work out flexible arrangements with their tenants. We are in ongoing conversations with both the Government of Canada and our provincial counterparts across the country on any potential next steps. We already did commit to, I think it was $66 million to participate in the federal commercial rent protection program. So we'll take a look at this. We will consult with the small business organizations like the CFIB and others. But let me say that at the end of the day, we cannot, the taxpayer, there's a limit to how much we can spend. We cannot continue to provide a kind of open-ended public subsidies for things like this for months and months and months to come. We know that COVID could be with us for some time. So what we have to do is find, I think that the best thing we can do is just to encourage landlords to act rationally at this time, but we will look and see if other additional measures are required in the short term.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Kevin Nimick with CTV Calgary. Go ahead, Kevin.
Hi, Premier. As you're aware, 98% of Alberta doctors want you to switch Health Minister Tyler Shandro out of his portfolio. Why are you holding on to the Health Minister who has such a poor relationship with key medical professionals during this pandemic?
I think Minister Shandro has done a fantastic job of getting us through the COVID crisis while also addressing huge challenges that we were elected to address. Our government is accountable not to 10,800 people who belong to an interest group. We are accountable to 4.4 million Albertans who elected us with the largest democratic mandate in Alberta history just over a year ago. One element of that mandate was to get to a balanced budget by stopping massive increases in spending. The 10,008, let me restate, of course, what we believe in and say every day, which is that we respect our physicians who are a key element of our healthcare system. We respect them so much that we compensate them more generously than physicians in any other Canadian province. And in fact, our physicians receive about 20% higher compensation than the average across Canada, according to the Canadian Institute of Health Information, Dr. Janice McKinnon's panel, and the Ernst & Young Performance Review of Alberta Health Services. Alberta physicians receive about $100,000 more in gross billings than their counterparts, for example, in Ontario or British Columbia. They also pay lower income taxes and benefit from a lower cost of living. And all of that is fine. But here's the issue. We are in the midst of an economic and fiscal crisis. Our economy has shrunk by 20% over the past 5 years, while physician compensation has grown by 23% over the past 5 years. Private sector families have seen their incomes collapse, in many cases, on average by 10%, in many cases by much more than that. Nurses, teachers, and people in the public sector have been stuck at zeros in terms of their collective bargaining agreements, but the 10,800 physicians, who represent 1/4% of the Alberta population, have seen a 23% increase. So you've got a 20% decline in the economy. You've got private sector families seeing massive cuts in their income, public sector families seeing flat incomes. But the most highly paid people in the public sector seeing a 23% increase. If we did not bring in a new physician compensation framework that stops these annual average pay increases of 6%, we would see, Alberta Health estimates, an increase of $2 billion in physician compensation over the next 3 years. And we simply don't have the money. We simply don't, and there's a question of fairness here as well. The 10,800 physicians who are 1/4% of the Alberta population represent 10% of the total expenditures of the government of Alberta. And that's fine. These are people who work extremely hard. They are, by definition, essential to our healthcare system. They spend years going through university, delaying income and incurring debt. They do have overhead costs to pay for, and they have very challenging jobs. And we honor them, and we're fine with compensating them at the highest level in Canada and the highest level in Alberta history. But in this face of an economy that has shrunk by 20%, we cannot say that 1/4% of the population can benefit from continued increases in compensation when they already represent 10% of the government budget.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Lauren Krugel. Actually, it looks like Lauren has dropped from the line. Our next caller is Janet French with CBC. Go ahead, Janet.
Hi there. Question for the Premier. Thanks for taking my question. I'm just curious what sort of legal analysis the government did on Bill 32 before introducing it. What sort of advice you got internally on whether it's constitutional. That seems to be one of the major challenges. And, you know, we will hear from the NDP today and have heard from them that they find it unconstitutional and they find it unfair, undemocratic, the way that the government had approved that bill by using time allocation. So I'm just wondering if you could also respond to that.
Well, I'll start with the last point. First of all, our government has used time allocation very sparingly. We've passed, I think, 64 bills since coming to office and have applied time allocation on only 4 of those bills, which is 6%. So on 94% of the legislation, we have not used time allocation. We've only used it when it's clear that the opposition is engaged in an endless filibuster designed to frustrate the passage of a platform commitment, and when the government has permitted robust debate. In this case, House Leader can correct me, I think it was about 24 hours, 28 hours of debate on Bill 32. So 28 hours means that every member of the opposition had the opportunity to speak for over an hour on the bill. And at some point, and I completely recognize the opposition has not just the right, but the responsibility on bills that they strongly oppose to seek to delay them, to filibuster them. At the same time, the government has a responsibility to implement its platform commitments. And how do we reconcile those two competing interests and responsibilities? Well, I think it's by allowing a robust debate, and that's certainly what 28 hours of debate is. In terms of constitutionality, Janice, I would remind you that the provision to which you refer, which is effectively an opt-out from people's union dues going to advocacy campaigns and political campaigns, that was an explicit commitment to Albertans in the last election. So it was in our platform, and we developed that commitment after extensive legal consultation with some of the country's top labor lawyers who looked at the constitutional jurisprudence on this. Finally, I would point out to you, Janet, that polling indicates some 75% of union members in Alberta support the idea of being able to opt out. We believe it is, frankly, offensive that people should be compelled through their forced union dues to pay for advocacy which violates their most deeply held values or their own economic interests. There are many, many uniform members in Alberta who do not want to be forced through their dues to pay for campaigns to campaign against pipelines, against the oil and gas sector. Unifor has opposed every single pipeline, and they are therefore campaigning against the interests of many of their members in Alberta. As I've pointed out before, the people who belong to Unifor, who might be refugees from the socialist dictatorship in Venezuela, don't want to be compelled to pay for campaigns to support that Venezuelan dictatorship which they fled. Jewish union members in Alberta don't want to be compelled to pay for campaigns that attack the Jewish homeland of Israel. And I could go on, and this is this provision, which was endorsed by Albertans in the last election, which we believe to be entirely lawful, recognizes the right of those members to withhold their money from campaigns that attack their values and interests.
Okay, we have time for 3 more. Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
This is Bob Weber with the Canadian Press. Go ahead, Bob.
Hello, this is a question for Minister Nixon. Minister, your department has filed reports recently about the Bighorn backcountry that have unveiled a lot of serious problems with overuse and just general destruction. I'm wondering what you're doing to respond to reports from your own constituents of overcrowding, damage, First Nations concerns, and lawlessness. Are you planning to add more infrastructure or any enforcement? Just what's the government's response going to be?
Well, we are seeing, not just in the areas west of Rocky Mountain House or west of Sundre, I'm not sure specifically what you refer to as the area known as the Bighorn. That's known as different places to many different people. It's not actually a term of an area in a province, so it's a term that's been used to describe different locations. But we are seeing a tremendous amount of use all across the Eastern Slopes, but also in every provincial park and every recreation area in the province. As a result of what's taken place with COVID, Albertans are staying home, not traveling as much, but they're going out in their backyard to be able to recreate. That's something that was important to Alberta's government, and we took steps to be able to make sure that provincial parks and other recreation areas were open to be able to accommodate that. So the situation taking place west of Rocky Mountain House and Sundre in particular right now is no different than what we're seeing all across the province. We continue to work closely with the Conservation Officer Enforcement Division within Alberta Environment and Parks, as well as with our partners at Justice, with, of course, Fish and Wildlife, and the RCMP to be able to help manage that situation. The department has also provided increased ability to collect garbage in those locations because of the increased activity. And ultimately, we'll continue to move forward through our North Saskatchewan regional planning process in that area, which will result in some infrastructure investment in that area to deal with some of the concerns that have been long-standing in those areas. And lastly, we continue to work towards the Trails Act initiative that was in our platform, as well as modernizing parks legislation and public lands legislation, which will include a trail fee, where that trail fee will be dedicated to trail maintenance, but also to enforcement and to helping manage these areas. And lastly, I would add to that, to helping communities like Rocky Mountain House and Sundre in particular in those areas to be able to help deal with increased activity that puts a strain on things like volunteer fire departments and volunteer search and rescue departments. But the reality, what is taking place in that location on the Eastern Slopes is exactly what we have taking place all across the province because of increased capacity because of COVID, and we'll continue to do our best to manage that with our partner agencies across the province.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
Next is Mirna Juchik with Radio Canada. Go ahead, Mirna.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my questions for the Premier. Premièrement, j'aimerais revenir sur le vote de confiance envers le ministre de la Santé, vu qu'il y a 2/3 des médecins de la province qui disent qu'ils ne lui font pas confiance. Est-ce que vous allez accepter de vous asseoir vous-même avec l'AMA comme il le demande? Deuxièmement, il n'y a pas seulement avec l'AMA que les tensions ont monté. Là. Elles ont monté avec plusieurs syndicats au cours de la session. Puis avec des projets de loi comme 1 et comme 32 qui viennent gérer un peu les activités politiques et le pitage des syndicats. Qu'est-ce que vous avez à répondre aux gens qui vous accusent de jeter de l'huile sur le feu en utilisant les lois?
Merci. Tout d'abord, nous sommes responsables auprès de 4 millions Albertains, pas 10 000 membres d'un groupe d'intérêt spécial. Nous sommes élus avec un mandat pour gérer les finances de l'Alberta de façon responsable. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous ne pouvons pas permettre la rémunération des médecins à continuer d'augmenter par 6% par année, particulièrement quand l'économie est dans une crise. Nous avons vécu une diminution de l'économie albertaine de 20% en 5 ans. En même temps, la compensation des médecins a augmenté par 23%. Sans l'action responsable du ministre Chandro, nous aurons une augmentation de notre 2 milliards de dollars dans les prochains 3 ans pour les médecins. Même quand les familles dans le secteur privé ont vécu une crise financière et les familles dans le secteur public. Alors, nous sommes, comme j'ai dit, nous sommes élus par plus d'1 million d'Albertains. Nous sommes responsables à ces électeurs, à ces contribuables, pas à un groupe d'intérêt spécial qui représente un quart d'1% de la population, mais qui reçoivent 10% de toutes les dépenses du gouvernement provincial. Nous voulons travailler avec nos médecins, c'est important, mais il faut gérer les plus grandes dépenses du gouvernement de l'Alberta, particulièrement pendant une crise économique et fiscale. En ce qui concerne les projets de loi 1 et 32, je dirais tout d'abord que le projet de loi 1, tout simplement, augmenter les peines pour les actes illégaux. comme les gens qui, de façon dangereuse et irresponsable, bloquent l'infrastructure essentielle, comme les chemins de fer ou les autoroutes. Et ça ne diminue pas du tout le droit de l'association, le droit de manifester. Ça existe toujours de le faire de façon légale. En ce qui concerne le projet de loi 32, je rappelle que 75% des membres des syndicats en Alberta, selon les sondages, appuient leur droit de décider eux-mêmes si leurs frais de syndicat sont utilisés pour les campagnes politiques contre leurs intérêts ou leurs valeurs. Par exemple, il y a le grand syndicat Unifor qui prend les frais des travailleurs albertains pour faire les campagnes contre le secteur énergétique, y compris les oléoducs. Alors maintenant, avec l'adoption de ce projet de loi, ils auront le pouvoir de décider si les patrons des syndicats vont faire la campagne avec leur argent contre leurs intérêts. Et comme je dis en anglais, je crois que c'est épouvantable qu'avant le passage de ce projet de loi, les membres, par exemple, les ressortissants israéliens en Alberta qui sont membres d'un syndicat étaient forcés, avec par exemple Unifor, à faire campagne contre l'État d'Israël. Les réfugiés provenant du Venezuela ont été forcés avec les campagnes de Unifor et les autres syndicats d'appuyer la dictature socialiste en Venezuela. Et les travailleurs, trop souvent, sont forcés de faire campagne contre leur propre job, leur propre boulot dans le secteur énergétique. Alors, c'est un engagement électoral que nous gardons. Nous avons fait l'analyse légale et nous croyons que ça va donner la justice aux membres des syndicats décider où vont leur argent. Thanks very much. I'm sorry, after 2 straight nights, my French isn't so great, and thank you very much for all the questions.